Hello, everyone, and welcome to the long-running series, Whooply Wednesdays. God, that's so fucking cringe. The joke is that I don't have a long-running... Anyway. Today we're reviewing Elden Ring, which just won Game of the Year award at the Game Awards. So naturally, being the jaded, cynical gamer that I am, I have to jump on the bandwagon to, unhype it, to say that the game was never that great. And, naturally it was a failure. Or, as I'm calling this video, or today's episode, the death of Dark Souls. Elden Ring review. Hopping into things, I think we should just start off with background so you know where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the game. And then also, obviously, spoiler alert, I'm reviewing it. I'm going to include spoilers because I want to talk about the game pretty in depth. So yeah, we'll hop right into it with my background. I have played every Soulsborne game in the entire series. So that includes Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, obviously, Bloodborne, and Sekiro. So I'm very well versed in the series, in the mechanics, and the evolution of the series. And honestly, I'm a fan. I think if I had to isolate a single series that I really enjoyed, this is it. I think their games are super mechanically satisfying. I think the world building is super interesting. So obviously going into Elden Ring, I had expectations associated with that. You know, I there's things that I like about the series and things that I don't, but then on the whole, obviously I really like it. So I was sort of hoping to see a lot of that in Elden Ring. And I think it ended up being a bit of a mixed bag. But moving forward, in terms of other qualifications or background, I'm a super completionist. And so I played Elden Ring 4.5 times, almost 4 3/4 to completion. That was all a New Game Plus, so I ended up on New Game Plus, what is that, 5? So yeah, I played this game to death to a certain degree, and have fully explored everything on all the maps, all the zones. I, in total, played it for just over 120 hours, and then obviously I also have all of the achievements. And in addition to all of that, I also got every grace. I also got every emote. I also got every talisman. I got every spell. And I got every Ash of War. So, yeah. Play the shit out of this game. That's my background on the game. I ended up liking the game. As cynical as I am, I can't say that I didn't like the game on the whole. I think that would just be disingenuous. But I was also a little disappointed. But before I get all negative Nancy, sort of like, contrarian, I wanted to actually just start out what is good about the game. And I think the most obvious thing is just the world itself. In my opinion, this is the most fully realized open world ever in an open world game. Just the way that the levels sort of like merge together and sort of flow. It's just really impressive how you can spend your time starting out in Limgrave. You get to see the castle the whole time, see the whole scope, and then every zone you pass through, it sort of, unveils another layer, opens up an entire world that you can basically, spend a lot of time exploring all the nooks and crannies of, and how it all fits together into a single continent is really impressive. So the second thing that I really like about the series is the spectacle boss fights, and I actually think this, I think Elden Ring is the best version of the spectacle boss fights that Dark Souls has ever done as a series. So obviously, that includes Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, Star Scourge Radahn, and Renala, Queen of the Full Moon. I think all of these fights in particular were really memorable. Renala for the visuals particularly, Radahn I think for the mechanics and the sort of, the entrance in phase 2 and just how that works like mechanically with the allies. And then for Rykard specifically, the integration of the spears, they've attempted that fight a couple of times or, throughout the series in terms of like giving you a special weapon in, Dark Souls 3 or, just pretty much every version of every game where you have like a special counter. But like visually, mechanically, it was super satisfying. The moveset worked really well with giving you that extra range. The phase 2 was really cool as well. Spectacle boss fights were just really, incredible on the whole, which is, I think, a sharp contrast to some of the older, quote-unquote, spectacle bosses, namely, Bed of Chaos. Yeah, in terms of other stuff that I really like about the game, I think the core combat is the most fleshed out it's ever been in the series. So you can do like a strength build, which is generally what I do, with giant swords, giant shields, just sort of like fat rolling around. You can do like dexterity builds with like dual wielding swords and katanas and just, dodge rolling in circles. Lots of sorcery spells. I think a lot of people say that the Elden Ring spellcasting system is one of the best in the entire series. And granted, I don't usually play a spellcasting build, but I think it's hard not to disagree when you see just the pure variety of spells available in the game. You have the Spirit Ashes as well to add in some additional sort of like difficulty levers, and particularly if you're like a tank build or a mage build, like having someone who can you can juggle aggro with or help you do damage, adds like a co-op element to it. Even if you're like playing the game solo, that I think is pretty cool. And then also the Ashes of War are also really, really interesting, even for like melee users like myself. It still gives you some additional variety to tackle the different challenges in the game. And then lastly, the thing that I really, really enjoyed about the game is ultimately what made me enjoy the entire Soulsborne series, which is that the legacy dungeons are still really good, or in other games, just what is the core sort of level experience. So this includes Stormvale Castle, Raya Lucaria Academy, Volcano Manor, and Lindell as well. These were a lot of the highlights of my experience in Elden Ring. And, as someone who's been playing the series for a long time, it's pretty obvious why, because they harken back to the traditional design, which is why, the community generally refers to them as legacy dungeons, because they are much more formulaic in terms of the rest of the series, providing like a more condensed, tighter Elden Ring experience that's really dense as opposed to, or Dark Souls experience that's really dense as opposed to really wide, which is what the rest of Elden Ring is like. So that's what I liked about the game. There was a lot that I didn't like as well, which is sort of why I wanted to sort of talk about this, because I think the game didn't get universal praise, but I think is generally well reviewed. But as a longtime fan, I was actually disappointed a little bit. So there was pieces that I found fell short relative to my expectations for the game, and I think what it could have been, as someone who generally enjoys open world games. So first up, I think that the open world is a lot of why I didn't like the game, and particularly that the open world killed the pacing and killed the tension of the core game. There's sort of this core gameplay in the entire Soulsborne series that really boils down, in my opinion, to do I keep exploring and risk my souls, or do I stop and sort of try to bank them, or farm up, spend your souls that you have sort of stored in these items. And that sort of like tension of like the push forward and risk soul versus like return back and bank your souls, I think is a lot of why the Dark Souls series, the Soulsborne series, is so compelling, because in having to push forward, you don't necessarily know what's ahead of you, so there's a lot of like unknown and sort of psychological lack of safety there. But that's also like why it's so compelling, is that core tension is there. But I think Elden Ring, a lot of this falls apart. So a lot of the reasons why I think this doesn't work is specifically because the bonfires are so just, they're everywhere. Like if you just look at all these bonfires, they're all over the place. But yeah, I think part of the problem is that there's just so many bonfires spread out throughout the game, to the point where it feels like anytime you want to retreat, it's just super easy to, go back to one that you've already been, or you come across them so frequently that it doesn't really feel like a challenge. And I think the other half of this, and to me, like the main problem with the open world, is actually this guy, Torrent. He, I think, makes you feel so powerful as a player character, because he can fundamentally dictate how you choose to take engagements in the game, right? In traditional Soulsborne series, where there's not a mountain, movement is much more limited. Generally speaking, running past enemies is extremely risky, because chances are they'll catch up to you, or you'll get stuck on some doorway, or, some combination of that. But in Elden Ring, and especially in the open world, it's very easy to just sort of like run by enemies by the hundreds. And the play pattern that ended up appearing for me when I was exploring the open world is just running around grabbing all of the items, and then unless an enemy looked unique, I just would ignore 90% of them, because it wasn't really worth it for me to actually engage, and there was no requirement of me to be able to actually fight or engage with the combat at all, because I could just easily run away. That combined with the double jump that provides you a lot of direction and stability there, it feels very good to control, and I think like mechanically Torrent is really nice to use. But it also, I think, robs that core tension experience of like push forward and risk reward because it provides you so much safety unless you're just playing like with your brain off. The other thing that I really don't like about the open world specifically is just how thinly the legacy dungeon content is spread out. It makes, I think, a lot of sense given their design of trying to, give each zone an open world part to explore and then conclude in a legacy dungeon as sort of like a way to finish the zone. But ultimately, what that experience looked like for me is that these legacy dungeons, the highlights of the game, are just super thinly spread out. So, highlighted in these different areas were a lot of my favorite parts of the game, the things that really made me feel like it was worth playing. But in between all of that is just these wide open areas that will take you, 3 times, 4 times as long to explore in terms of just pure number of hours that will, ultimately eventually lead to these highlight moments, but are the minority of the total game content as opposed to the majority. So I think if they were more connected together, it would make me feel like it was more rewarding or more engaging, because in those legacy dungeons, you're much more restricted. You don't have the mount. Bonfires are a little bit, more thinly spread out, and it captures, I think, a lot of the cool tension, risk reward, sort of engaging gameplay that the more restrictive environment leads to, as opposed to just a more open-ended, like player agency-driven aspect. So thing number 2 that I really didn't like, open world aside, I think when we're talking about the more linear areas, these should be pretty familiar to most people. Because you see them a lot. The copy paste sort of mining shafts plus tomb is just too predictable. And especially as a completionist who saw every single one of these, it reminded me so much of like the Skyrim like cave dungeon exploration, where it's just like at some point there's just so many of them that feel so similar. It's ultimately just super unrewarding to actually explore, because the question that you eventually run into is like, is the content going to be worth my time? Which feels much worse than like, I can't wait to see what's in there, which is, I think, the feeling that, should hopefully be cultivated with the player, right? When you initially start up the game and you don't know what to expect, you want to explore everything, because like anything could be a possibility. And in some of these mine shafts and some of these dungeons or tombs, they do actually add unique content, like specific NPCs, like the patches area, or, a couple of like, I say unique bosses, and I'll get into that. But on the vast majority of them feel like pretty, cut and paste. And obviously the, open world philosophy, it feels like in a lot of open world games, is that the assumption is that the player is not going to experience them all. So therefore it's okay if you like copy and paste, because like they're just not going to see every single one. But as a completionist, obviously I see everything, and it ultimately it's a solvable problem if they actually, made every piece of content unique. Obviously, it requires a lot more work to do so, but because they didn't, and what feels like took the shortcuts, it ultimately, I think, devalues the entire experience, since, there's essentially time being wasted in these, like, less interesting areas. And this is also exasperated, as I said, by the reuse of bosses. So this one, obviously, again, is something that people will surely recognize as an enemy. And the amount of variations of either boss or just generic mob that are in these tombs that use that model and moveset is just way too many. And I think a more poignant example of this is this guy right here, which I forget his name. But essentially, he is a very unique boss that is found in a super optional area and one of the like most important quest lines in the game. And when you get to him in that area, you're like, oh my God, this is so cool, because visually it's a really interesting boss. It's really unique. You sort of had to work for it, and it's super relevant to like an important quest line. And then you find him in a random cave. They reuse him in a random cave in a late game zone as another boss. And it just like totally ruins the magic of having beat him the first time, because it just feels like, they can just cut and paste any boss, and it loses what made it special, loses what made it interesting. It's like if they copy and pasted Millennia into just some random like dungeon in some random area. It's just like, okay, well, now this is a lot less interesting, because all of like the epicness, the uniqueness of it is just lost. And so it's sort of a similar issue to all of these things. And then the last thing about these dungeons, especially going back to the question of like, is this worth my time, is the reward often I don't think is. Because you get so many fucking crafting materials just everywhere on corpses, just hidden around, that are meant to be like, when you go up to a corpse, you don't know what you're going to find. Maybe it's like a piece of armor, and maybe it's like a consumable soul like bundle that you can used to level up. But every single time you get a crafting material, because I don't think crafting is really essential to the game at all, and generally it's like more effort than it's worth, every time you get these like random crafting items, to me, I was just super disappointed, and like it felt like just complete filler content, filler loot that was super unrewarding. So I'd rather do that than, to be fair, like the traditional game design on the West of just like RNG loot, because that undermines the value of loot as a whole. But still, I don't think this is a solved problem in terms of like finding a way to actually make loot more interesting, because it basically, I think, devalues loot overall in terms of like wanting to loot everything, which is a shame. So the third main reason why I didn't like Elden Ring, and I think the third main problem with the game, is that I think the game is not balanced for the open world. And specifically, I think the difficulty curve is a mess. You start out level 1, the world is your oyster, and everything is automatically higher level than you, so the opening experience is naturally difficult, and I think that's fine. And then at the end of it, you also end up where it's a bit of a challenge, because everything in the end game scales up to you. It catches up much more quickly, so that it's much more balanced. So that all sounds fine, right? Because then, the beginning is like pretty challenging and it ends pretty challenging. But I think the problem is that the majority of game was actually really, really easy. And if I had to give it like, a number, just sort of rough estimate, I would say out of the like 100 hours of my first playthrough, I'd say like 60 of them were just kind of a pushover, and a lot of it was the open world. Part of that is, I think, the trivialization that your mount gives you in terms of just how much agency it gives you to actually escape any consequences of risky decisions or putting yourself in danger. But then I think really fundamentally it is a balance issue when it comes to, especially the way that I played it as a completionist, just the amount of souls you have relative to the world balancing. And something else that people have talked about a lot was how the level scaling is not super dynamic. It seems to be relatively flat. And so it's very possible to over-level a lot of these areas. So just to walk you through sort of my experience, the game started out pretty hard. So that would be like the Limgrave area, and then heading into Stormvale Castle, because at this point you're like level 1, everything else is higher, and so you sort of have to work your way from nothing. But then it got really easy for me. And so these entire 6 zones, Weeping's Peninsula, Lunaria, Ray Lucaria Academy, Atlas Plateau, Mount Gilmer, and Sofrey River were all kind of pushover, rarely died. Ray Lucaria also, in particular, was, I think, really disappointing, because I did the entire surrounding zones around it first, and then went to the Academy, and so the whole zone just melted before me. But then it got a little bit hard again, because then I moved on to the areas like Caelid, and then the Volcano Manor through the Invitation, and those areas are much more difficult. And so even though I was pretty overleveled for the previous zones, obviously like it seems like it's a new tier of level, and so I felt like the good kind of challenge. But then for the next 7 zones, I felt like it was way too easy. So Nokron, the Eternal City, Deep Root Depths, Ainsel River, Lake of Rot, Lindell, Mountaintops of the Giants, and Consecrated Snowfield. A lot of these were not super difficult, and I rarely died on them, and it was more of just like kind of busy work, just running on horseback throughout the different areas, trying to loot everything, trying to just, get all the graces, trying to collect everything, and then move on. And then finally, at the end of the game, it gets hard again through Mogwin Palace, Mikola's Haligtree, Elphael, Brace of the Haligtree, Crumbling for Missoula, and then finally Lindell, the Ashen Capital, because at that point, it's the end of the game. And so the level scaling, again, seems to jump a tier. And so you can see that these things are sort of tiered. My guess is not in the way that I organize them, but sort of like flat, where they're based on these sections. And so the more sections I do, basically, like it trivializes the entire content in that like tier. And so I think the problem is that, even though like these theoretically are all a part of the same tier, and these theoretically are all part of the same tier, but you start out in these beginner areas, and then by the time you sort of like start getting to this, then the rest just becomes super trivial, and then you bump up a tier, and then again the rest becomes super trivial because they're all on sort of the same level. And so I think a dynamic scaling system, especially for completionists like me, would have made the game much more engaging, and it would have reinstilled some of that like risk reward feeling in the open world, or even in some of the more linear levels. Like I said, Ray Lucaria and Lindell Royal Capital were both pretty trivialized by my outscaling, even though they were actually legacy dungeons and had that more like controlled environment, and didn't give you the horse. And so I think to recap, 13 of the zones overall were easy, compared to 9 of the zones that were hard. And it's interesting because if you sort of divide them out, 11 of the 13 of the easy zones were open world that I listed, whereas 5 of the 9 of the hard zones were legacy dungeons. And so I think it sort of illustrates like the problem with the open world design in that fundamentally the open world did not really feel like a Soulsborne game to me. It felt like it took the combat of the Soulsborne but didn't capture, not to say that like Soulsborne games have to be difficult. Obviously, they're known for the difficulty, but specifically that tension, that risk reward feels really lost. Also, which is a combination of the pacing issue, but also a combination of the fact that it's so easy to overlevel a lot of the content, especially if you're trying to go out of your way to do a lot of it. And so ultimately, I think what the problem with this and what it leads to is that you ultimately get punished for exploring. Which, I say punished, like you sort of rob yourself of the experience because you just end up collecting a fuck ton of souls and, a fuck ton of runes. Now, obviously, you don't have to use all of these runes, but even then you're collecting so many runes from just killing enemies, assuming like, you're being efficient and not like dying to stupid things, which if the content is easy is sort of harder to do. And it just leads to the over-leveling problem where, it's probably not that extreme. But generally speaking, it trivializes, I think, a lot of the content that is supposed to be, much more interesting. Now, if you really wanted to like self-dictate, you could just like intentionally lose your souls, but you have no sense of like how difficult the game is going to be, or how to like appropriately set the difficulty there. So I think requiring the player to have that level of discretion and that level of foresight feels, pretty unrealistic. And on the flip side, I think the difficulty with this is that exploring is also required. So one of the things, for those of you who've seen the Donkey video where he talks about Elden Ring in his review, is he did a bunch of different playthroughs, but he did them on a bunch of different characters where I focused on New Game Plus on a single character. And his experience was that the game was actually too hard because he didn't focus on much on completionism and on exploring, and specifically for the new characters that he made, he just beelined all of the content. It's very clear that the content is not designed to be beelined in that way unless you're basically a masochist, right? The open world serves as a place to be able to acquire runes, to acquire souls, to give you levels, to then make the choke points, the legacy dungeons, a lot more, easier if you're struggling with it. But it ultimately feels like you're not meant to beat it without at least some investment into the open world cycle before you return back to the original or back to the legacy dungeon to ultimately, progress in the story, progress in the levels. So I think that's sort of one of the double-edged swords around this design. And I think a dynamic system for the difficulty may have been a much better solution here. So that way the player could engage with the entire game on their own terms as opposed to just the legacy dungeons and not being punished for playing in either a way that is very aggressive in terms of, pacing and completing the game versus a way that's more, completionist style, or the way that I like to play. So ultimately, what does this mean? For me, it means that Elden Ring was kind of a mid Soulsborne game. So I broke down the entire Soulsborne genre into tiers so you can get a sense of like, what stylistically games I like, and give you a sense of like how I compare it and rank it. So in my tier 1 or S tier, I have the original Dark Souls and Sekiro. Sekiro, I think, because the combat is so well refined and so satisfying, that it just feels great to play, and boss fights are really an execution of skill. Dark Souls, I think, was the original, impetus for a lot of the foundational design that was built in a lot of the later series, and obviously Demon Souls is a little bit of that too. But Dark Souls, it feels like they refined a lot of it. And then also, I think the level design in the original Dark Souls is some of the best in the entire series. Obviously, as someone who likes the legacy dungeon style of content, Dark Souls, I think, does a fantastic job with the Firelink Shrine and the way that everything ties back into that. Tier 2 is ultimately where I'd put Elden Ring, as well as the original Demon Souls. Demon Souls, again, is much more of a traditional game in terms of the Soulsborne series, level design philosophy. Elden Ring, I think, given the things that I liked about the series, has a lot to offer, but is just, again, has so many glaring issues in my mind with the open world design that I think are solvable problems. They're not easy problems to solve, but they are solvable. Ultimately, it makes me feel like the game is held back in a lot of different regards. And then finally, that leaves Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and Bloodborne as sort of tier 3. I think Bloodborne is probably going to be the most contentious of all of those different pieces. For a lot of people, like the aesthetic of Bloodborne is phenomenal, and the combat feels really fun from like a pacing perspective. But Bloodborne also, I think, falls backwards in a lot of ways. particularly with the Return to the Blood Vial system or the Grass system from Demon Souls. I think that was sort of a step backwards, and would have liked to see some version of the Estus Flask, or maybe using the Retaliate mechanic a bit more as a core form of health. Yeah, so ultimately I didn't find that as fun. And then I think in general you can see Dark Souls 3 and then Bloodborne are some of the faster paced aspects or faster paced games in the series. And I also think combat kind of breaks down sometimes if it's too fast. And so I think Bloodborne as well sort of falls into that problem. In addition to, I think, some bosses and content being pretty easy to cheese through the parry system. I think the parry system with the guns are pretty generous considering how many bullets you get and how quick it is to be able to parry. And so it doesn't feel like it has the same risk reward as like Sekiro, for example, in terms of committing to a parry and timing it correctly. And it feels like you can cheese a lot with the parry system. So yeah. Steamrolled through the end there. But that is my Elden Ring review. Thanks for watching. Yay. So anyways, hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like my content, feel free to check out some of my other videos. Goodbye.